Talking about Justin Trudeau up in Canada, the Freedom Convoy.
Well, Justin Trudeau,
about that.
I've been on his case for years. This is a guy who actually said we can't use the word mankind anymore because it's offensive, because it has the word man in it. I didn't like to tell him the word woman has the word man in it, because that would have been too complicated for his woke brain. But Justin Trudeau is the kind of king of wokedom. You know, if Meghan Markle's the queen, he's the king. And he's been caught here in a trap of his own devices, where he has no idea how to lead his country through what is ostensibly a peaceful protest by people who have a legitimate cause. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what they're saying, but I absolutely defend to the death their right to protest in the way that they've been doing. And I think that Trudeau, by bringing emergency powers and having the police rounding them all up like it's some, you know, fascist state, this is what I'm talking about. This is a form of fascism going on. And yet he would profess to be the most liberal guy you'd ever meet in your life. And yet he's behaving like a fascist. And this is what I mean about the hypocrisy of the woke movement, if you like, the woke brigade, is that they say one thing, they say they stand for tolerance and fairness and equality and liberalism, and they behave in a completely different manner. And I find that in what's happening in Canada, these are shocking scenes.
Yes.
This should not be happening. And if you go and talk to Canadians now, it's not just the conservative right who are complaining about this. A lot of people on the left are saying, this is ridiculous. How can this be happening in our country? And this is what happens when you have a very woke leader who doesn't understand actually how to govern a country properly. And it's I think it's a shambles to watch.
Well, look at these issues.
I am probably, if anything, slightly on the liberal side, all right? But I've never parked myself into any partisan box. What I've felt is that people who claim to be liberals have become the very opposite of what liberals are supposed to be. They've become illiberal. I call them the illiberal liberals. And in a way, this kind of ultra-woke cancel culture mentality, which is sweeping the world now, and certainly in the UK and here and as far as Australia and so on, what it's designed to do is to bring in a new form of fascism, which is, of course, the very thing that liberals would always say they're most against. And yet here they are, cancelling and shaming and vilifying people and trying to make people conform to their very narrow worldview of how you should lead your life, what you should find funny, who you should admire, how you should speak in public. And the number of people who come up to me and say, thank God you're out there,
right,
making the clarion call for free speech. Because if you don't have free speech, you don't have a democracy. And I see so many people now losing their jobs for expressing an opinion. I see so many people terrified of expressing an opinion. And I'm thinking, right, I need to do a show where every night I'm taking this on. I want to cancel culture. I want to get back to a democracy where you and I, like we used to when I was at CNN, could go at each other,
right,
whether it be about gun control or wherever it may be. We may have a different view, but at the end of it, we'll go and have a beer together.
Yeah.
Because that's what democracies used to be based about, the strong exchange of opinions. When I see what's happening on university campuses right now, not just in America, but in my country too, it is terrifying. It is terrifying that any conservative voice is now just no platformed as a matter of course, as if somehow this is acceptable, that students should only ever hear one opinion at university, a place where they're supposed to go and receive a wide-ranging education with all views and then form their own. That's not what's happening now. And I think you see it at very low level at school when kids are very young. They're getting brainwashed at a very early age. They're getting brainwashed at university. They're coming out. They think this is a perfectly acceptable way to be, that if you have a friend who has a different view, you have to shame them, you have to get rid of them, you have to cancel them. When did this happen?
It's very hard to say what the worst thing is that happened to Canada in the last 2 weeks, because 6 things are worse, and each of them should be fatal to the Trudeau government. But I think perhaps the worst was the decision to suspend Parliament on Friday from discussing the Emergency Act because of the action that was instituted by the police as a consequence of the Emergency Act. He's accused the Conservatives of supporting the people who waved swastikas and tried to associate the truckers with Nazis, and went after a Jewish Conservative MP. Many countries in Europe had started to lift vaccine mandates, and that had been lifted in many states in the US, that none of that was occurring in Canada at all until the truckers started this protest. And so now these 5 provinces have started to lift their mandates, and more are going to follow. And they aren't claiming that that's a consequence of the trucker protest, but the truth of the matter is that we know that this is being run by opinion poll, which is a terrible way to run a government, and that nothing had changed before the truckers started to protest. And then we should also point out that we have an 86% vaccination rate in Canada. That's one dose vaccination anyways. And that no one with any sense would ever think that it would be possible to push vaccine rates above approximately 90%. And so it's terrible naivety to assume that it can be pushed beyond that. Well, we want to figure out, well, why did the truckers get demonized, and what are Canadians supposed to think about that, especially because FinTrack, which tracks financial transactions, and is supposed to be taking care of such things as terrorist financing, has no evidence of suspicious transactions occurring in relationship to this protest, and that's was documented by CTV, who is hardly, you could hardly accuse of being sympathetic to the truckers. So there's that. Then there's just exactly what is the emergency here, and why is it reasonable under any conditions whatsoever to consider this an emergency of such major proportions that our basic civil liberties have to be lifted. Then the ability to freeze and seize bank accounts, which generates distrust in the banks. The precedent to define retroactive crime, because now funding a perfectly legal protest through legal means has been criminalized and associated with terrorism and organized crime, and can be punished without trial by fiat, and that appears to be permanent. Then we have the extension and redefinition of crime, because mischief has now been expanded as a category to arrest people without cause, and now you can aid and abet mischief.
It's amazing. He says things like individuals are trying to blockade our economy. Individuals are trying to shut down our economy. They're trying to shut down our way of life. Dude, that's you, by a mirror, Justin Trudeau, explaining that he's shutting down freedom to protect your freedom. There's a lot of burning the village in order to save the village rhetoric that's come out of the COVID restrictionists. Has to stop. Well, I mean, the same thing could be said of the mandates that you have placed on your country over the course of the last couple of years. I'm sorry, he's so irritating. And by the way, I'm not the only one who finds him irritating. The Canadian public finds him extraordinarily irritating. In fact, Trudeau's own party is starting to turn on him over COVID restrictions. According to Politico, a backbench lawmaker from Justin Trudeau's own caucus is accusing the Prime Minister of dividing and stigmatizing Canadians by politicizing vaccine mandates and COVID-19 restrictions. As the Omicron virus shows itself to be less lethal and positive test rates fall, the truckers are sending a message to Democratic governments it's time for the pandemic emergency orders to end. The cause of this protest happens to be righteous. For 2 years, says the Wall Street Journal, the truckers were classified as essential workers and therefore exempt from vaccine mandates. About 85% of them are vaccinated. But Justin Trudeau, who heads a minority government, has chosen this moment to order that truckers be vaccinated if they want to cross back into the country from the United States. The Canadian left is calling all of these people Trumpians. Trudeau smeared them as, quote, a few people shouting and waving swastikas. But of course, that's not what this is at all. And it just is part of the general left-wing attempt to paint anyone who disagrees with them as a racist or a Nazi. They have this bag of insults that they go to every time somebody disagrees with them, God forbid. And then they just throw them. Like, here comes the swastika. Boom. Just hit them with the swastika. Just say that they're a Nazi. And what is the evidence that the thousands and thousands of people in Ottawa protesting so they can maintain their jobs, that those people are Nazis? He doesn't have any evidence. Instead, what the media have been doing in Canada and elsewhere is they've been nutpicking, is what it's called. They find a few fringe members of the protests, and then they say, these people represent the entire protest. It's a global thing. This is not just in Canada. It turns out that human beings do not like having their liberties restricted in this way in the West. They're used to it in China, because China is an authoritarian tyranny. They may be used to it in Russia. They may be used to it in actual tyrannical states, but they're really not used to it in the West, and they don't like it. Majority favors lifting restrictions, suggesting the Trudeau mandate, which went into effect on January 15th, was a political miscalculation. By energizing a significant part of the electorate, until now less present in public discourse, he set off a backlash, deepened Canadian polarization, and raised the stakes in a showdown with the truckers. The global left is beginning to feel it, because they've spent the last 2 years insisting they're on the side of the science, and they're not on the side of the science. It turns out that the best thing that they could have done would have been to shield the vulnerable, as they did in Sweden, and then to allow people to live their lives. Instead, they decided to restrict everyone. And again, the pitch is that freedom itself is bad. We have to crack down on people using the word freedom. See, if you say freedom, what they hear is Nazi. This is how perverse the wild left, the COVID restrictionist left has become. Here is Justin Trudeau explaining that he's shutting down freedom to protect your freedom. There's a lot of burning the village in order to save the village rhetoric that's come out of the COVID restrictionists.
Individuals are trying to blockade our economy, our democracy, and our fellow citizens' daily lives. It has to stop.
It has to stop. Well, I mean, the same thing could be said of the mandates that you have placed on your country over the course of the last couple of years.
The real problem is that once you give governments power, they don't give it back. They don't want to give it back. What's fascinating to me is watching what's going on in Canada right now, because the truckers have taken over Ottawa, right? They've just overwhelmed Ottawa with thousands and thousands of trucks. And so now they have these laws where you're not allowed to refuel them. You're not allowed to give them food. GoFundMe tried to steal the money, which is wild. They got $10 million in donations for the truckers, and GoFundMe thought it would be great if they gave that money to the charities of their choice. You fucking imagine the gall of that after they, listen, I'm not saying they shouldn't have supported Black Lives Matter. I think you should support, I think GoFundMe should be available to anyone who wants to use it for anything that's where people can argue that it's a good cause. And the Ottawa truckers, a lot of people think that's a good cause. Black Lives Matters, a lot of people thought that was a good cause. The fact that you can make a distinction between one and the other, if they had taken all the money that was donated to Black Lives Matter and they said, you know what? We don't agree with this. We're going to give it away to the charities that we choose. You'd be like, fuck you are. People would go goddamn crazy. In Quebec, you can't buy groceries unless you're vaccinated. We need to look at this and make sure this is true. But when you get to that
I know someone was telling us this last night.
Yes.
It was a Canadian.
Yes.
So he might be right about that. But that is, see, make sure that's true.
Yeah, let's make sure that's true. It's wild. And the way Trudeau talks about people who are unvaccinated, the way he said that they're misogynists and rapists, or racist, I'm putting words on. He said they were misogynists and racists. And
you're in the demonized class all of a sudden.
You're deciding, you're taking people that have a perspective on a medical intervention, and you're deciding that you're going to demonize them in the worst possible ways with no evidence.
And isn't it something that so many of these people, like say the nurses who are unvaccinated, the truck drivers who don't like the mandates, that they were the heroes.
Right.
These were the essential workers, the healthcare workers. These were the people in New York City. They were clapping at 6 p.m. every day for these workers. And there'll be nurses who worked through a year and a half of the pandemic.
And they didn't want to get the shot.
And now all of a sudden, these are the, you're out of there.
Unvaccinated to be accommodated at all times in Canadian Walmarts, Costco's, to ensure they're buying pharmacy products only.
What?
Unvaccinated to be accompanied at all times.
So to make sure they're not getting food?
Yes. They have to buy pharmacy products only.
So how do they eat?
Well, I don't know, but in Quebec, that's what this guy was saying. In Quebec, you can't go to a grocery store unless you're vaccinated. Vaccine passports to enter the vicinity went into effect on Monday. This mandate includes all businesses with surfaces. But here today in Alberta, I think they dropped their vaccine mandates. And I think this is in response to the truckers.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
truckers are, that. You don't want to fuck with truckers, man.
You need them to get your stuff.
I thought he was kind of a cool guy. Then I started to read what he said. This is a couple of weeks ago. He was, or maybe this is September, but he was talking about people who are not vaccinated. He said they don't believe in science. They're often misogynistic, often racist. No, they're not.
That was not smart of him at all.
Right. He said, but they take up space. And with that, we have to make a choice in terms of a leader as a country. Do we tolerate these people? It's like, tolerate them. Now you do sound like Hitler.
That was...
and recently he talked about them holding unacceptable views.
Wow. I'm surprised to hear that Trudeau said those things.
You didn't see the blackface? I mean, no, I'm kidding about that. I'm not. I mean, that was not a good look for him.
No,
but I mean, come on. I mean, that's I think what gets under people's skin.